But I believe it is indeed recording. So, Dark Bleatings, everyone. I am really, really delighted today because we are here with Kit Power, who, as any regular reader or viewer of Happy Goat will know, is one of my very favourite authors, just full stop, like my top five. He's a writer of numerous short stories, novellas, novels, and is the sort of creator of the horror on Ginger Nuts of Horror non-fiction series, which has now been taken over by good old George. We love George as well. But yes, so we're here with Kit Power. Thank you so much for being here, Kit. It's like a thrill to have you on the channel. And you are also here by popular demand. A few people did request you. So
Oh, that's
no
lovely to hear.
pressure.
Thank you so much. No, right, but no, I appreciate the invitation. No, seriously, it's lovely to be here. Thank you.
So if we can start with my life in horror,
Sure.
um, I personally I say this to a lot of people that I find I don't know if I prefer your fiction or your non-fiction. I think you're equally talented in sort of both. You know how to weave a tale, and it's like it shows up more in your non-fiction work, I think, just because non-fiction, for whatever reason, can have a reputation for being like a little bit dull if you're not particularly interested in the subject.
Hmm.
But you've written a whole bunch of articles which have been compiled in these lovely hardback books. And even when I wasn't familiar with the topic of the essay, I was very much invested in how you wrote about it. So, can you talk a little bit about how you got the idea to do this and what started it off and everything?
Sure, yeah. It was so I mean it's going back quite a way now. I can't remember the first year I started doing it. Might have been Christ, might have been 2014. Could be that long ago. I'm not sure. But I'd basically I'd started writing fiction. I think at that point I'd written Lifeline, maybe The Loving Husband and The Debt. I think I'd just gotten those two published with Black Beacon Press, or like this Australian publishing house, in an ebook format. So I think Loving Husband was maybe my first release that had just come out with the debt backing it up. They wanted a novella, and I didn't have something that was 15,000 words, so I just glued a couple of longer short stories together, and they took them, which was nice. I actually auditioned with Lifeline, and then they said, "No, that's too scary, but can we, like it's too extreme, but can we have something else?" So. And I was looking desperately for outlets to get reviews, and I kind of stumbled across Ginger Nuts I mean, I did that thing I think a lot of people maybe do when you start writing and you join Facebook, right? You just friend request everyone that says they're a writer or connected to horror and just sort of see what happens. But so I sent it to Jim for review. I didn't get a reply, but I saw that he was soliciting articles at that point. So I did a kind of I can't remember. I think I did like a 30 minutes with interview, which was the template he was running at the time. And he was also running a series called The Book That Made Me. And I thought, well, I could do him a piece about Stephen King's It, because that's like just one of the most important pieces of work I've ever come across. Just a really like, I mean, I could effectively kind of talk about that book and its impact on me forever.
Yeah.
It's one of those just like seriously, it's ridiculous. So and I was kind of a bit I was a bit cautious about it because I wasn't obviously I'd barely heard of me, let alone anybody else. I was quite nervous about approaching Jim to ask to write about it because I knew it was such a big novel. But Jim just said, "Yeah, go for it. That's fine." So I did the essay. He really enjoyed it, and then we were chatting on Twitter, and I said to him something like, "If you ever decide to branch out into the film that made me, I will give you an essay on RoboCop that you will, that will knock your socks off," kind of thing. Um, and he just kind of said, "Yeah, go for it. Great." Like, which is what Jim does quite a lot, actually, which is one of the cool things about him. So I wrote the kind of now slightly infamous the film that made me, about why RoboCop is the greatest movie ever made, which I just had an absolute ball writing. I had so much fun writing that piece, and I really kind of, I don't know, I think I hadn't really thought about nonfiction as an outlet for me up to that point, but I realized I just really enjoyed, especially with that one, just letting rip, just really kind of like, tearing a big old lid off the opinion can of worms and just chucking it all over the place. I mean, at the point at which I'm on Ginger Nuts of Horror saying RoboCop's the greatest horror movie ever made, like, I realize I'm like out on a limb and taking the piss a little bit, but I'm having so much fun. Um, and it was just pure happenstance. But at that point, Jim had just reached a point with the site where it was far too big for him to manage the review requests he was getting. Like, he couldn't cope. The reason I hadn't gotten a review for Loving Husband was because he just deleted 2 months of email because he was feeling terrible about it piling up, and he just couldn't do it. He couldn't keep up. So he was looking for people to come in and do stuff. And he basically said, well, do you want to, I really like the Robocop piece. Do you want to do something on a regular basis? Right. And I was like, sure. What do you want, Jim? And he was like, well, how about something a bit like Robocop, please? Because that was good. And I was like, well, I can't pretend something else is my favorite movie in the world next month. That's not really going to work. So, but we kicked it about a bit, and My Life in Horror came out pretty quickly. I thought, because I took him serious about saying I want essays in that vein. And I thought, well, okay, what else could you write about? And it just occurred to me, like, actually, especially with the piece I've done on it as well, like, well, yeah, sure, I could talk about childhood influences, right? I can talk about the stuff that I really enjoyed or was really disturbed by, even maybe as a kid, as a teenager, the things that kind of shaped my thinking and kind of shaped my creativity to a certain degree. And I remember putting a list of about a dozen titles together. And even that early on, I knew I wanted to branch out, right? So I knew I had the Wasp album, Headless Children, was on that list, as well as The Thing and Nightmare on Elm Street, the things you'd expect to see. I was already starting to play with the format and saying, well, what about, can I talk about music? Can I talk about other things as well? And Jim just, just said, yeah, just go for it, whatever. I don't care. It's fine. Just do what you want to do, and that was it, really. It just started from there, and it wasn't quite a monthly schedule, because some months I got busier than others, but most months, I think, from then until till last year, 2 years ago, when I finally stopped writing it. Yeah, most months I'd sit down and write My Life in Horror, and the list grew longer, obviously, as I went along. But what I really liked about the project was it was a real safety valve for me, because the rest of the time I was trying to write fiction. I was trying to work on short stories, or then, God Bomb, my first novel, I got the idea for that and I wanted to start hacking away at that. And it was really nice to have a space I could go to where, no matter how hard the fiction was getting, I could just, tear off an evening and a couple of thousand words into a total, passion project, just talk about something that had really, inspired me, or that I'd really enjoyed. And it was cool because I just picked the topic month by month. There was no master plan. There was no kind of chronology. I didn't start at the beginning. It was just what do you want to write about this month? Okay, let's do that.
It was such an interesting series, and I read them all as they were published on the website, but then obviously I reread them all when I got the books. And the really interesting thing, if you're reading them in a closer time frame than when they were released, so back to back, or a couple of weeks or something, is there's so much variety about your influence, the things that influenced you for your horror taste, but half of the things in there aren't even horror things. So it's really interesting hearing you talk about because I guess art is subjective. Everyone's got their own take on. So Kit talks about for people who haven't read any of these for some crazy reason, we're talking books, films, music. It's sometimes the topic I was like, what? There's no way you can wrote that background to horror, but then and they're autobiographical essays, obviously, because we're getting snippets of your thought process when you were a kid and a preteen, teen, and all of this. So yeah, I think that it's my favorite article series, and I was so relieved that you had put these into physical copies, because of what happened with Ginger Nuts when lost all of the content. Oh god, I felt so much. I only have my website for 2 years. I can't imagine being Jim in that scenario with all of the years. But I was like, it was one of my first thoughts. I was like, oh my god, at least it survived.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, actually, just to say, Jim he has now got an archived version of the site up on the new one, so it is there. Yeah. The problem that he's got is that there's no easy way to index it, so you can get into it, but what it's not at the moment is searchable, sadly. So the stuff's all there still, and the My Life in Horror stuff that I wrote, and the beginnings of George's essays are back up on the site now, which is a huge relief. But yeah, it was a heartbreaking moment, that, I think, for all of us, because the site really felt for me like a almost like an archive of indie horror of the last sort of decade. Really, it's an incredible resource.
Yeah, and I feel like it's like a pal's place because, like you said at the start, before we started recording, we were talking about like I can't remember when we started recording now. I've been reading a lot of books recently. My brain's a bit fried from my challenge. So yeah, when you first become like an indie author, there is like a thing to like befriend as many mutual authors as you can and things like that. And I know that I met quite a lot of people through Ginger Nuts of Horror because Jim, I can't even actually remember how I got involved with Ginger Nuts now. I wrote an article series. Which I've forgotten the name of.
Challenge Kaylee.
Challenge Kaylee. Thank you.
It's a great series, by the way.
But that was I was doing book reviews occasionally first, so I don't even remember how I got like introduced to Jim, or I think I must have just found Ginger Nuts when I was looking for indie horror stuff, and that's definitely where I met you.
Yeah.
And a few other people. It's yes, it was quite sad. I thought good on Jim for having the mental wherewithal to relaunch, and I don't know if I probably would have just gone oh no. So, your handover episode. So yeah, so you wrote these articles for a long while and then handed it over to George, and your handover stream was brilliant. So I've already spoken to George about that.
Yeah.
So for anyone who missed that, Kit handed the reins over to somebody else to continue the series once he was done with it, and the way they did it, well, I was floored. I was in the comments. Kit appeared ill, and then he transformed into George, and he mentioned a couple of times at the beginning that he wasn't feeling well, and we were all in the comments like, "Oh, Kit, it helps. You'd log off if you need to." So it was a great transition that you guys pulled off. I was really impressed with the how it looked.
Yeah, I mean that's all on George. He did all the effects work on that, which was fantastic. I mean, that was fun because I mean, as it was getting towards the end, Jim was getting really kind of upset about the idea of the series as a whole finishing because it had been, it had been a long running part of the site. I'd enjoyed doing it, and I can't remember exactly when it was, but I hit on the idea of carrying of saying, well, why does it have to end? Like anyone could write this, anyone could write a My Life in Horror series. I mean, anyone still could actually. And I thought, well, why not? Why not see if someone else would be willing to take it on? And it was a very, very short list. But luckily George said yes straight away, and like he bit my hand off, which is wonderful. And I knew he had already had a good relationship with Jim, and I knew Jim would love it. And I mean, part of the reason that I wanted, that I asked George to do it is because I mean I've worked with George for a long time now in our own podcast series, What the Hell Is Wrong with Us, which is not dissimilar to My Life in Horror in a lot of ways. And I realized that I would be really excited to tune in each month to find out what George was talking about in that format. Like I know a lot of his influences, but I don't know all of them. And he has a very different writing style to me. He's got a very different approach to non-fiction as well as fiction. Like his approach to literary criticism is very different to mine. And I was and am genuinely thrilled that he agreed to take it over because I knew it was in very good hands, and I knew he'd produce a body of work that would be very different to the kind of things I did, even if we were talking about the same subject. But then obviously having hit on the idea of doing it, you start toying with, well, how do you hand over? And, you could do it the boring way of just saying, right, I'm quitting and here we go. But I'd already let people know I was finishing, and I was doing the crowdfunder as well. And that was actually, it was getting a bit hairy, volume 2. I wasn't sure I was going to make my, I wasn't sure I was going to make the, make my, make the amount I needed, make my target goal for the funding. It was a couple of weeks. So I kind of thought, well, it'd be good to do something that will give that a bit of a boost as well. And that's when we hit on the idea of, the idea of doing an essay on the essay was Exquisite Corpse, which is a book that was a huge influence on me, but perhaps an even bigger influence on George. And it just fell into place very naturally. And then I just sort of said to George, well, look, if we're going to write this as a joint essay and I stop halfway through and regenerate into you, I said, why don't we do it as a video? Why don't we see if we can? And then George just went, yeah, brilliant, as he always does, because he's awesome. And then he just went off and did it. I mean, I don't know how he did it.
It was quite
It was mental, but he set it up as also the guy who set it up as a spoof live stream, so it looked like a live stream.
Yeah, I really did. I was laughing, and I'm sure that I'm sure everyone that was watching was like, when we realized, I was like, oh, it was so good. Yeah. George is possibly the most enthusiastic person I've ever met, like talking about anything that he cares about. And the only person I've ever seen with more enthusiastic energy is Grady Hendrix. But maybe actually on par, I would say.
Yeah,
really, if you put those two in a room, conversation would be unending, probably.
I think you'd solve the power crisis at that point. Like, we'd have infinite energy for all.
Yeah.
Somehow hook it up to the grid, we'd be all right. Yeah.
I will, for people who are listening and only half know what we're talking about, I'm going to put the links for everything we're talking about in the description for people who want to check things out. So if we move on to your fiction,
Sure.
where to start with your fiction? Let's start with your debut.
All right.
Novella. So God Bomb, which I proofread for you, and I was completely useless with my feedback. I remember it well. since actually having stuff published myself, I now know how annoying it is when someone goes, "Oh, what are your critiques?" and you go, "Oh no, I really liked it. Nothing." But I sincerely felt that way when I read it, and this is about a guy who wants to speak to God directly, and he makes a threat on a church if God personally doesn't come to speak to him. And I don't like, where did you get your idea premises from? But what was it that you wanted to explore with this story?
I mean, the thing about God Bomb is the idea had been rattling around in my head since I was, I think, like 19 years old. It was my first abortive attempt to write a novel. And I wrote, the problem I had at that age, well, actually, the problem I had at that age that I didn't know was that I had undiagnosed ADHD, which was why I struggled to concentrate on things for very long. But as far as I knew at that age, the problem I had was that I couldn't sustain a longer writing project. I'd write short stories, but if I didn't get the idea finished in one session, I couldn't get back to it. I could never get back into the space I was in. And God Bomb was my first very abortive attempt to break that duck, and it was completely unsuccessful. I only wrote the first chapter, which, funnily enough, isn't in the book, because I rewrote it when I started the novel, but then I cut it for when it was printed, because the first chapter of the novel, as I'd originally conceived it, gives you like a tour of the church before the story starts. So you've got the band playing, Mike playing the saxophone, the preacher getting ready, and you do like a kind of tour of the heads of the principal characters. You get to meet them, a little bit about why they're there, and they think a little bit about, and it was okay as an opening, and I certainly needed to write it because it helped me get a sense of who the characters were. But when I came to kind of the text of the novel itself, I realized that I had to write it, but the readers didn't need it. I could cut right to the beginning of the action and do all that stuff kind of in media res. But I think I'm sorry, I've forgotten what the question was. What was I trying to explore? What was it? Yeah. So and I got the inspiration for it. I mean, I do remember this one. I don't remember a lot of them, but I mean, the inspiration is I went to an event very similar to the one depicted in the book. I was 19. There may have been a girl involved, and there was this, as it turned out, it was a born again kind of revivalist thing. I mean, I didn't know what it was because they were quite coy about how they advertised it, and I went along out of curiosity. I mean, I was quite a kind of sort of borderline unpleasant kind of militant atheist at that point in my life, and so I knew I wasn't. I felt it unlikely I was going to be converted, but I think I had a bit of that kind of young, aggressive kind of, show me what you got kind of energy. I don't know, and it just baffled me. It completely baffled me as someone who'd gone to Church of England schools and been to Anglican ceremonies of various kinds over the years, as you do, weddings and christenings and stuff. It was just unlike anything that I understood Christianity to be, anything I understood that kind of form of religion to be. And I remember just worrying at it for weeks afterwards, like trying to make sense of it. There was something really, as aggressive as I was about my atheism, they were as aggressive about their faith. I felt like there was a real kind of sense of like, this need to assert that, no, this is all really true. This is all really real. A sense of certainty that I just bothered me. And not long afterwards, I think I somehow got access to the God channel. There's a bit where Alex talks about getting drunk and yelling at the God channel. That's something I actually did at that age. And just kind of realizing there was this whole world of born again Christianity and I didn't understand it. I was mystified by it. And I think I think at the time, I mean, I'm really glad I didn't write it then, because I think at the time I found this sort of shameful thing to admit, but I was 19, I was stupid. I found the bomber to be a more sympathetic character probably than I did when I sat down at 30 to write the story. I think I'd gained a lot more perspective on life following that. I was a lot less angry about religion as well by the time I sat down to write it properly. But yeah, the idea had been sitting around for a hell of a long time in my head, and I just liked the premise of it. I liked the contained nature of it. I liked the feeling like it was all going to happen in a single day. There's a ticking clock. It's one location. My favorite reading experience is when you pick up a book and you get to the end of the first chapter and you just have to read the second chapter because you've got to know what happens next. And suddenly it's 4 a.m. and you got matchsticks, but you're still like that's just it. That's my preferred. There's many enjoyable reading reading experiences, but that is my favorite. And I wanted to try and recreate that. That was the kind of vibe I wanted to create with God Bomb. So that was why it appealed to me, and why because I'd been writing short stories and stuff for about 18 months. My plan was to sell a couple of short stories at pro rate before I went to a novel. But I wrote 2 or 3 short stories in a row that were just awful, just really bad. Yeah, everyone does, right? Everyone does. But I'd had a good run, right? I'd written a few. I mean, most of the stuff that turns up in a warning was written during that period, and a lot of it was quite. I mean, it was experimental, right? Stuff like Conference, which is just 500-word dialogue between two. Well, it turns out 2 aliens, right? And stuff like that. So I mean, I was definitely playing with form, figuring stuff out, but I was having fun, and I thought what I was producing was pretty good. And then the inspiration just dried up. I had, as I say, 2 or 3 in a row that just sucked. Sucked bad enough. I didn't even want to send them to critical readers. I didn't even want to try and salvage them. And I just thought, what's going on? And I thought, what's going on is, at the moment, you've taken writing short stories as far as you can, and you're not learning anything. You got to try and do something you're not sure you can pull off. So that's when it was like, okay, so it's time to try for the novel. It's time to see if you can sit down and write that longer form piece.
Yeah. There's it's, I think I read this in one go. It's got this great like isolated feel, like this is happening over a short period of time. So it feels like you want to read it as close to the time it's set in as possible, if that makes sense, rather than put it down and come back. And funnily enough, of weird things to have in common, I too went to a church event when I was in my angry atheist phase. When I've never really believed in anything. Like, I think I realized when I was about 6 in a school assembly when we were all doing the Lord's Prayer, and I was like, all of a sudden, like, who am I talking to? Yep. And then when you open your eyes and look around, if you don't also believe it's a bit weird. Like when you suddenly, like, everyone's talking with their eyes shut. And it was someone very close to me was getting baptized, and that came about very fast because they went from not religious at all to they went to church with their friend, and then they were being baptized. And it was an evangelical church run by an American pastor, and the energy. I've been in churches, but only for things like a Christmas concert or funerals, unfortunately. And I do think that the British are a bit more subdued in how they celebrate their religion than maybe the Americans are, because that experience to me as like a non-believer, but I wanted to be respectful and I wanted to support my loved one. Sure. It was very bizarre to me though, because everyone was very like, praise Jesus, and it was like loud and lively and like fun, but I was like, this is a completely different world to me. Like this was. And it was eye-opening because everyone getting baptized was so happy. It meant so much to them. And I was like, wow, this is like a different side of religion because I was just banging on about how can you believe the stuff in the Bible and the atrocities because of religion and things. And then when you're in like a little sort of like group like that, they've all got that in common. You're like, oh, there is a nice side. Like it was lovely, like some of the family. So it was weird. So like I had that in the back of my head when I was reading this. I thought you captured different viewpoints across the characters quite well, and it's really tense for people who haven't picked this up. And also, how dare you have a debut this good? It's unfair. I'm not gonna do that thing where I just gush endlessly about your work and embarrass you while I'm talking to you one-on-one right now. But yes, I think everyone knows that you're you're like an inspiration to me, because I read this and this made me I didn't know how good indie fiction could be, because I was very new to the scene, and I was like, oh, this makes me like want to go ahead and throw my hat in the ring. So yeah, you influenced me a lot. I know I've told you this, but like, yeah, you very big sort of like writing influence to me, Kit. Like I looked up to you like since I started reading your writing the same way as I do with, you know, Ramsey and Adam Neville. And I really think, and I tell everyone this and anyone listening now, I really think like you've got the talent to do this full time for like a long career. And I'm just think it's a matter of like talent and getting the breaks. So
God, sure.
yeah.
I mean, I really appreciate that. I mean, as you know, I'm a fan of your writing too. Genuinely, I think you're really very talented, and I think, I mean, I've said this in reviews as well, but I mean, blending comedy and horror is an incredibly difficult thing to do well, and most people who try and do it will fail at one or the other, normally quite spectacularly, often both. You're one of the few writers I know that consistently can pull it off in the most incredible way, and I think you're very gifted. So it's lovely to hear that I'm an influence. Obviously, that makes me feel great. That's wonderful, because I really admire what you're putting out in the world. So that's great.
Thank you, Kit.
Oh, thank you.
I think I've just got a silly thinking brain. I don't even mean, sometimes people go, oh, I really liked the dark comedy in that story. And I'm like, I didn't mean to do that. That was what I was calling one of my like straight horror stories, but okay. Speaking of shorts, let's go into Voices, your Black Shuck Shadows collection. So these Black Shuck books are a series. They're unconnected from each other, all written by different authors, but they're always themed as per the author's theme, and they're really, really fun to read for that reason, because it's always fun discovering what the theme is as you're going through. And yeah, a bunch of my favorite stories you've ever written are in here. There are many. Let me just, I'm going to get the titles wrong if I don't double check them. Yes, so All Loving, All Knowing, also on a sort of like godly theme, that one. That was one of my favorites. And Pulling Teeth, I think I might have read that one in something before. Maybe an anthology?
No, you might have been a beta reader for it, but this is the first appearance of Pulling Teeth. But I might have, I might have bunged it over to you for beta reading, yeah.
Yeah, the Pulling Teeth is the best example of, and I mean this as like the highest compliment. I know some people don't like to be compared, but that was a Stephen King story to me.
Oh.
Pulling Teeth. It was it read like if Stephen King allowed people to do an anthology that was like set in the world of The Shop from Firestarter or something, like sure. that would be like a perfect inclusion. You have such weird ideas, and I really enjoy, but like in a good way. Weird, unique ideas is what I meant.
Sure.
And I think that your first person writing, and I've said this in my reviews, I think that you really excel when you're in the first person. And you've written several first person narratives, and they never feel like the same character from story to story, and that I think that requires you to do you're kind of acting a bit as you write, because you're in the character as you're doing it. So what is it about first person narrative that draws you, because you've done quite a bit of it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think I mean, Voices, actually that's kind of the theme of Voices, is that they're all first person stories. That was kind of, I kicked a couple of ideas around with Steve, but that was the obvious one for me, and it helped me because it wasn't too restrictive. It meant I could still have a variety of kind of story or narrative palettes to play with, and it also helped because those collections are typically a mixture of previously published and unpublished work, and so it in a useful way it restricted the previously published choices because they had to be first person, and it meant stuff like The Garden got dug out, which I wouldn't necessarily have anticipated publishing again otherwise, but I love that little short story, and I wrote it a very long time ago, and it's nice to see it come out. It's just sweet, and I really like it at the end of that collection because Voices is so fucking nasty. Oh, sorry, can I swear? I'm not sure if that's the thing. Yeah, because Voices is just so fucking nasty. I mean, that's the one thing about that collection. Reading it back, I'm like, wow, there really is something wrong with me. But what I like about first person, is the acting thing. when I was sort of 16, 17, I mean, you'll know this from the My Life in Horror stuff. I wasn't going to be a writer. I was going to be an actor. Like, I was very clear on that. I got the theatre bug at like 14. I had a wonderful kind of accidental, illness, last minute stepping in thing where I got to play Peter Quince in Midsummer Night's Dream. And if I wasn't hooked before that, I sure as hell was after. And, I was very, very, very serious about that. And, although obviously that didn't pan out remotely as a creative career for me for various reasons, there's still a part of me that's really fascinated by character and character work. Like when you're acting, the script, I always felt anyway, the script was almost like a treasure map or like a topography of the character. And what you had to do with the script as an actor was look at that and go, okay, so if these are the things this person would say out loud, what is going on inside their heads such that is what they would say out loud, right? So you're trying to dig into the psychological clues from the dialogue that tell you, because the dialogue's already got to go on, right, to tell you like, who is this person? And that was my kind of approach to acting, because I once I understood who the person was from the inside, the lines would then feel completely natural, because I understood why they were being said. So I had to do that level of kind of excavation. That was just that was my approach to acting. That was what I did. And that, I think that still applies when I'm writing fiction, especially for the first person stuff. And I think that's why, because the first few pieces I wrote were all first person. Lifeline was the very first novella I wrote. That was first person. Loving Husband, The Debt, The Bar at the Edge of the Desert, that was a very early one that was in that period as well. And again, it was partly mechanical, I think. I was using first person because I felt comfortable with it, but I also really consciously wanted to make sure that the voice sounded and felt different each time. That mattered to me, because I think one of the things that I'm kind of fascinated about with humans is just how, considering how the physiology is normally, broadly speaking, pretty much the same person to person, we're just fantastically different on the inside.
Yeah.
Psychologically and emotionally, we can be very, very alien to each other, I think, in any number of ways. And I think, it was kind of important to me in those early stories, partly because I'm stretching myself as a writer, like, okay, now write someone different. Because I think the guy in Lifeline, it's not me, but it's not far off, right? Like, I was working in a call center at the time. I was cycling home from work. I was doing late shifts. Like that was as close to an authorial insert, I think, as I've ever read. I was listening to Slipknot while I was doing it, right? Like that was, it was kind of a bit me. And I had I was in a serious relationship I wasn't expecting to be in, and blah, 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 right? I recently got a mobile phone. So it's really important to me after that, like, okay, do different things. So, Loving Husband, very different voice. And The Debt, I was starting to play with London accent, and the London voice, and kind of, because I'd lived there for a while. So I wanted to kind of give that authentic kind of working class London voice a bit of space. And since then, it's just become a challenge, right? It's just part of the fun. And I think Pulling Teeth is one of those where I had the title for months, just sitting there written down, like, you were going to write a story called Pulling Teeth. And then I got the idea. And as soon as I got the idea of, like, every time you lose a tooth, someone dies, it was like, okay, then it's got to be a kid, because that's the only voice that makes sense, right? It's a kid going through their teeth coming out. And I don't know, maybe kiddo, maybe my daughter at that point was going through that. Maybe that was going on in the background, and that reminded me of how it felt, because it's a weird experience. It's just a weird thing. Like, your mouth just changes, and you live in your mouth, and you don't think about it, but you do. And then suddenly the shape of it's wrong. Like, gaps are appearing where they shouldn't be. Bits are falling out, for Christ's sake. It's like, what the hell? So I think what I love about first person is it does get me back in touch with that acting thing, but also it's like, I really like digging in on, like, why do people do things? And I think first person gives you, I don't know a way of getting closer to that than first person. I think first person is the best way you've got in writing to do that.
Yeah, I also was a theatre person, and I wanted to be an actor, and I was very, like, method, like, you study all these practitioners, Stanislavski and all that,
Sure.
So I would be there, like, creating entire character histories for, like, a play I was in where I had 2 lines and I was a side character, but I really wanted to nail those lines. So I think that helps me a little bit when I'm writing character. But do you this is true for me, which is why I'm asking you. So as you've like got older or with like different life experiences, does the way you feel when you're writing maybe a heinous character, has that changed over time? Because I start to get a bit mentally drained now.
It's really, yeah, it's really interesting. I've heard this a lot. I mean, I've seen Brian Keene's talked about this a lot. He recently wrote another extreme or splatterpunk horror novel, which he hadn't done in a while. And I remember him talking about finding it really hard to get back into that voice. It's something that he did a lot, obviously, when he started out in his, I guess, in his 30s, but now he's, well, no, he's in his 50s, heading towards his 60s. He just found it, he got there, but he found it a lot tougher, and he found those scenes a lot tougher to write. I don't know. I've kind of, up until fairly recently, I probably would have said yes. I probably would have said I am finding it tougher, and sometimes I am. I mean, I think, yeah, as I say, it's rereading voices. And this is a ridiculous thing to say about something you've written yourself, but I am surprised by how nasty voices is.
Oh no, I understand. Yeah, sometimes I think, oh, did that come from me?
I was clearly in a worse mood than I felt when I wrote some of that stuff.
Yeah.
I think about Big Dog's one of the ones in there that I think really, like, I was clearly in like an absolutely foul mood when I wrote that. But I think, yeah, I don't know. I think when it comes to like that side of things, no, I can still tap into it. I mean, I don't know that I don't know how often I've written from a first person perspective that's super unpleasant, and that's kind of deliberate. In the original conception of God Bomb, I'd always intended to go inside the bomber's head, actually at the finale, and it was going to be the big reveal of who he was and what he was doing. But quickly, as I was working through, I realized I didn't want to do that, and that was partly because I was kind of a little bit nervous about humanizing him too much, because he was doing something so horrible. But it was also because I realized, and this is why God Bomb's in present tense, I realized the experience I wanted to create for the reader was the idea that you were kind of one of the congregation. You were kind of in that church, stuck in there with those people. And to do that, I kind of couldn't give you the behind the bomber's eyes view, because at that point, the spell would be broken, kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know, but I can still write really unpleasant scenes. there's a novella that I'm frantically trying to get finished by the end of this week. It was a new idea that just came to me 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I was suddenly like, oh my god, and I completely fell in love with it, and I've been like hell for leather to get it done. And there's some fantastically unpleasant things happening there, and I'm writing it with actually with a slightly deranged grin on my face most of the time. So yeah, there's clearly still something wrong with me on some fundamental level.
I've said this when I've done other interviews, is that you can read the most horrible, like deeply upsetting stuff, and then when you go to like a writing convention and you meet like, or you're socializing with all these horror authors, everyone is so nice.
Right.
Like, I find like the personality of horror authors, and it's even funnier when you're amongst like extreme horror authors and splatterpunk authors, and everyone's like having a cup of tea and like, oh, like, and everyone's very chipper, and like Ramsey Campbell is like the granddad I wish I had. You meet him and he is such a lovely, lovely man, and then you're reading his stuff, and I'm like, oh, that's horrible. I find that you're really, as well as creating, I always find your protagonists really, really relatable, and even in things like God Bomb, I think it is what you said about you're wary of humanizing someone who has a bomb too much, because you likely will fall into like, criticism for that from readers and things like that. It's the rage thing with Stephen King. Everyone said that was glorifying school shooters. I kind of had a different take. I don't know if it was the age I was when I read that, but that actually wasn't my take on it personally. I didn't think that he glorified it, but then maybe if I read it now, maybe I would think he did. I don't know, but it's villains are much more interesting when there are relatable things about them that you could see yourself. And most people have some level of empathy, so they're not robots. And there are always reasons for why people do the things they do. So I think you're very good at creating like full layered characters. And in your first person writing, this is like, I'm just swiftly moving on to like technical
Sure.
the actual writing now. I have noticed in your first person writing that one of the reasons I think I like it so much, as well as great character work, because I'm very character centric. So you do plot and character really well, but I have like forgiven other books where I wasn't that fussed on the story, but the characters were great.
Sure.
But the thing that I noticed that you do in your first person writing as well is, I don't know how you do it, but you sometimes manage to weave in like information that we as the reader know that the character doesn't seem to know, even though we're in their head, so we're seeing everything through their eyes. But then I'll get worried about things that they don't seem to have like realized as a threat or something, and I'm like, how has he done that? That's like, it's like an extra layer of immersion for me, I think, is like having awareness that the character doesn't have. And I think in first person, that's just, it blows me away. Like, that is not an easy thing to achieve.
I mean, I really appreciate you saying that, because that is something that I am absolutely obsessed with, and that I rarely think that I pull off as well as I'd like. So it's really, actually, it's gratifying to hear someone say that, because I tell you where that comes from. This is be a bit left field, but that comes from when I was in my 30s working in a call center. There was a guy who I hung around with quite a bit. We were both kind of young, early 30s bachelors working in a call center, right? So not much in the way of lives, let's be real. And we go out drinking most weekends and just hang out most Friday nights after work, and we just hang out and eat a cheap Weatherspoon steak and shoot the shit. He was a very different guy from me. He was into classical music. I was into rock. He was into classical literature. I loved horror. We didn't have a lot in common. It's part of the fun. But he was bright. I was bright. We enjoyed each other's company, and we enjoyed the challenge of the sparks of ideas and the arguments about politics, all kinds of shit. And he kept banging on about Boswell's Life of Johnson. You got to read Boswell's Life of Johnson. And I'm just like, I don't even like Dickens. Why are you going to make me read Boswell's Life of Johnson? Like Shakespeare I can do, but I'm not doing that. Anyway, eventually, I can't remember if he bought me a copy in the end, because he was so determined for me to read it. But I ended up with a copy, and I did, against my better judgment, read it. And I remember reading the first 100 pages thinking, well, I don't know what the big deal is. It's just a biography. It's not a big deal. But then what happens is, the first few pages is Boswell recounting Johnson's life before he personally met him. And then as soon as he meets him, the narrative grinds to a halt. And from that point on, you get every single detail of every single meeting that Boswell has with Johnson in as much detail as Boswell can remember, which is a lot. And suddenly you have this portrait of a man that is just, I'm not saying anything. This has been said a million times by people who have read this book. This is not a unique observation, but you just get this, so far to me, unparalleled portrait of a man, because he's been chronicled by this person who is obsessed with them and therefore details every single thing about them. And one of the things about Boswell's Life of Johnson that absolutely blew my mind is, Johnson better probably than Johnson knew himself, but you also get to know him better than Boswell knew him, because there are genuinely moments in Boswell's Life of Johnson where you, the reader, realize that Johnson is taking the piss out of Boswell. And Boswell is so obsessed with chronicling every single detail of the moment that he doesn't pick up on the fact that his mate is just taking the piss out of him.
Oh.
To the point where Boswell's sitting there going like, it vexes me. I do not understand why he would say such a thing. Like proper, like, this is not, it's out of character. I'm like, he's fucking taking the piss, mate. Like he's laughing at you because you're not, like, come on, dude. Like, and ever since I read that, I had this thing in my head of like, how cool would it be to pull that off in a piece of fiction? Nabokov does it in Pale Fire. Other people have tried it, but so going back to like the stuff we were talking about earlier, like actually that's what I was trying to do with Loving Husband. When I first sat down to write that, I thought, can I write a first person narrative where the narrator thinks he's got to get revenge for his wife having an affair, and you, the reader, suddenly realize that he hasn't. His wife didn't. and it's not a thing, right? And I did not pull that off. What I managed to do, which was the next best thing, I guess, was create a sense of ambiguity, and readers interpret that story how they want to interpret it. And that's fine. And I was really happy about that too. That was cute, because I got messages from people, everything from like, well, he's basically a decent bloke and he'll never do that again, through to he's clearly a psycho serial killer who's going to do this over and over again and will never be stopped, like, and all points in between, right? So I got a good story out of it. I've got a soft spot for Love and Husband. I think it's a fun little piece. I didn't achieve exactly what I set out to do. I really wanted it to get to the point where, as the reader, you'd just be like, oh shit, oh my god, he's just lost his, and I didn't quite. So but I've still got it there as a thing to try.
Yeah, it was a great story. I love that that shifting perspective thing and stuff. I had a funny real life moment. Have you seen The Menu?
Yes, yeah.
So I really enjoyed that. I sat down, watched it. For people listening, very quickly, it's about a really exclusive elite like dining experience with this famous chef, and this guy takes a date, because you can only go in pairs, and he's just like lapping up all of this like pretentious shit. Half of it isn't even food, and there's a theme to everything, and da 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 da. And I really enjoyed that. And like his date is like doesn't really belong there, so she's like, what, the guy's making fun of you, like what are you talking about? So I watched this alone, and then I went to tell my husband about it, and I was like, oh yeah, it's about this like like the rich, and they're just blind to and he listened to me enthused about this, and he was like, you don't see the irony? I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, you, a poor working class person, just sat there lapping up a message given to you by Hollywood, the richest people. And I was like, oh my God, I think that I've been made fun of. I was like retroactively offended by how like on board with this whole thing. I still really like it though. I still rate it, but I was like that. He comes out with stuff sometimes, my husband, and I'm like, are you sure that you don't write? Because he's really perceptive. But I was like, I think the entire world might have just been punked by that film, actually, now that you mention it. But yeah, your character work and how you portray the inner workings of a character, and then how they're perceived and how they're perceiving things. It's just so real. And even when you're dealing with things that are supernatural or paranormal, you always have this lovely sort of like gritty grain of like realism in there. So it anchors me to the story and the characters always. I have never once read any of your work and thought, well, that's a bit out of left field, including this.
Segue.
So this is a warning about your future enslavement.
Certainly is.
And this I was raving about when I read it, because I couldn't wrap my head around how you wrapped your head around constructing it. It's this is a collection of short stories and essays by Kit Power, which is in the title, threaded together with a central narrative. But it takes a while to realize like what is actually happening. And I just don't know how you did this. Because I had enough problem trying to link my stories in my micro collection, and that was just throwing in little references and trying to make them all of one universe. This is a whole different kettle of fish altogether. What prompted me?
Okay, so there's a few things to say about this. One, it was fantastically hard, and I never want to try and do anything like it again. So like, it was difficult. I think the second thing I will say though is it's easier. Okay, unlike most of my work where I generally don't know how it's going to play out. I have a premise, I have a character, and I have a situation, or characters and a situation, and I just roll tape and see what happens. That's normally what I'm doing. For that one, as you'll almost certainly have worked out for yourself already, the punchline came first because it had to. You You couldn't put that together. You couldn't make that shit up as you go along. You've got to start at the end. You've got to say, okay, the punchline's going to be ... and then you got to reverse engineer the narrative from there, right? So everything has to flow from that's where you're going to. So I think it's more, in that sense, it's a lot more baffling to read than it was to write, because I knew where I was going the entire time. So that helped, right? The meta narrative bit, I knew the punchline that I was trying to build to, and frankly, that's what kept me going when it started getting really difficult, which of course it did, because it was like, yeah, but it's going to be so funny. It's going to be so funny if you can actually land this sodding thing somehow.
Yeah.
So there was a bit of sunk cost fallacy at a certain point, because the problem I had was, so I was working with Dion for this one, who as my editor. And a lot of the short stories had already been published elsewhere, but some of them hadn't, and some of the blog posts were actually blog posts I'd done for my old band website when we were trying to keep that going. So I knew that it was kind of my only real last chance to capture those, because by this point the band was already sort of fracturing and breaking up. So I didn't want to capture anything like all of them, but the Richard Madeley one I was quite happy with as a bit of like ranty, and I kind of wanted to preserve that version of me, that voice of me from that particular period of my life as well. So that was kind of, it was kind of a fun opportunity to do that. But so I worked with Dion, and I sent him across the thing, and I sent him across the stories. But then the problem that we encountered was some of the ordering of the stories ended up not being right, and some of the stuff I'd included, it turned out, was superfluous or like overbaked it. I think the original draft had the Queen Greatest Hits 2 essay from My Life in Horror, and Dion sort of said, I love everything about this essay, but it just does not fit in this book. It doesn't work. It breaks the narrative flow. You end up treading water in the meta narrative as a result. It doesn't give enough new information. And it was like, okay, fine. And there were a couple of others where I ended up swapping stories out for other unpublished works. But the trouble was, every time you do that, it has ripple effects for the rest of the meta narrative, because it means our guy in the future doesn't know what he then knew, because he's not responding to the thing that you're. So like I ended up rewriting the meta narrative I don't know how many times, not end to end, but as I say, every point of change from then on, I'd have to read the entire rest of it to check that I hadn't left a dangling thread, or he was referencing something that he hadn't now seen or read or whatever. And it was just so hard. And I really do think if I hadn't A, paid Dion to work on it, and B, made it as far as I had, I probably would have thrown in the towel. It really was sunk cost fallacy. Like, no, I'm bloody finishing this, and then I'm never doing anything like it again. So yeah, I'm really glad you enjoyed it, because I'm not doing it again.
Yeah, well, the reason there's so many post-its in here is because I was like making notes as I was going along to review it, and that's the power of a good editor. Sometimes you need somebody in your corner that can help you, because when you're writing the thing, you're very close to it, so you do need someone sometimes. But yeah, I was just really. That's a hard one to like describe to people from scratch. Like, oh well, this book is it's it's many things. But yeah, I was like laughing at the end, and I was really impressed with it. It was it's such a fun ride, that one. Let's move on to Ending the World, which you've done several times. Got the finite song for the end here, and different scenarios and stories, but world endy. Is there something about the apocalypse that draws you particularly, Kit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I'm interested in I think I'm perpetually fascinated by I'm fascinated by mortality, right? I think one of the reasons I think it's quite easy to argue, as Ligotti does, that consciousness itself is a horror show, is because we are, as far as we know, unique certainly amongst the animal kingdom of this planet, in the fact that we are able to perceive our own mortality. We're able to be aware of the fact that we live, and at some point we're not going to anymore. And I think, especially if you're not religious, it's kind of a fucked up thing to try and get your head around. And I think it's something that we both understand and don't understand at the same time. I think I think we know it on an intellectual level, but I think most of us probably live as though it's not true in some fundamental way. And I think, and for good and bad, I think like that can go either way. But I think, it's something that fascinates me. And I think, I mean, I write because I read Stephen King's On Writing. Well, I read it when I was 11 and it freaked me out. And then I read On Writing when I was 30 and he said, go and write. So I said, okay, Steve, you're the boss. And I think, because he is. And I think for me, his injunction was right about what scares you. And I think mortality is kind of it for me. I think most of what I'm writing about, on some level, I'm writing about that. And I think, the apocalypse, the apocalypse is always personal in one way, because we all face it sooner or later, because we all face mortality sooner or later. So in a sense, they're all apocalypse stories. But I think every now and then I want to take that step back and think about, okay, but what about the end for everyone? And I don't know, like, I think part of it's obviously being a child of the 80s and growing up with Raymond Briggs' When the Wind Blows, and feeling like, oh yeah, right, we really could just all be vaporized in 30 minutes, like all of us, gone, and that's it, and we won't even know it's happening. And then, of course, in the last sort of couple of decades, that spectre's largely been replaced by climate change, or the climate apocalypse, as it's now likely to be. And it's a weird thing, because I think I'm always torn in two directions on this. I think every generation will write apocalyptic fiction, because every generation is wrestling with its own mortality and its own inevitable end. But I also think it's a very weird time to be writing apocalyptic fiction, because we are also actually living through one. And the fact that it's slow motion doesn't change the fact, although increasingly not as slow motion as I'd like. And I just think, I think if you're a horror writer, it's hard not to write about the end of the world right now, because it kind of feels like it's happening. I'm
really sorry if you can hear anything in the background from my house.
That's okay.
Can you hear it?
I did hear something briefly. I'm not sure what it was.
My cat trying to break my door down. Really sorry. If that was coming through while Kit was talking, I'm so sorry. The apocalypse is a fascinating area for me as well. It's one of my favorite subgenres of horror. I love apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic stories and dystopian tales of what happens after this version of humanity ends and we're doing something else. And I don't know why, but I find I find peace in apocalyptic stories. Like, I can't really. I think it's because I always feel like I need it somewhere, and the idea of just everything stopping is quite peaceful to me. But not in a. I would still want to live though.
Yeah.
So they're not in a really like nihilistic sense of, oh, what's the point in anything? But I always just think, well, if zombies came, I'd barricade myself in and finally have time to read all those books. Because I wouldn't have work hours or obligations. Although I suppose your obligations would change, like surviving. Yeah. That would be a thing. Everyone thinks they'd survive the zombies, don't they?
Yeah, and then we have COVID, and it turns out that most of us will just hide our zombie bites and go to the cinema. So, like, who knows, man? Right.
I think if there is a set of people that love to explore the idea of mortality and the many ways that can come about, it's horror writers. There's so many ways to do it too.
Yeah. And I don't know, I think for me, like, my particular fascination with it though is, I mean, I was thinking about The Finite and A Song for the End. They're both apocalypse novellas, apocalypse stories, rather than post-apocalypse, which I think is a different genre. And I do love post-apocalypse as well. Like you, I love imaginings of what a new social order might be, of how survival changes people and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we didn't do it for very long, but for a brief period, we were doing a series of recaps of Ginger Nuts on the Walking Dead series, and I really enjoyed. That was what was good about that show when it was good, I think, was exactly that. It was that exploration of, like, especially for me, the first season when they got to that kind of walled off town. And I know a lot of people were less interested at that point, but for me that was really exciting, because it was like, yeah, what does happen now? How do you rebuild? What does the society look like with all of this stuff going on? And I think, that I am fascinated by that stuff, and I think that's what makes The Stand as brilliant as it is, for all that. I'm not that wild about how it ends, but the journey's really exciting because a lot of it's about that. But for me, and maybe this comes back to that thing about like enjoying that kind of adrenaline fueled reading experience more than anything else. I'm kind of interested in like day one. I'm kind of interested in the beginning of the end, like that, just seeing the first few dominoes fall, feeling it kind of spiraling out of control. And I think, although they handle it in very different ways, I think The Finite and A Song for the End are both kind of that, because the Finite, a bomb's gone off, you don't know if others are going off elsewhere, you don't know. There's hints that maybe some of the infrastructure is still functioning, at least in the short term, but you don't get to find out, because your perspective characters in The Finite aren't going to make it.
That was the like the real hook for me, is like when your communication is cut off and you realize how reliant we are, and like not just for actual communication but just for peace of mind. Like we are not comfortable with not knowing if things are normal. Like it reminded me a little bit of the did you ever see that show Jericho?
I feel like I know of it. I can't remember if I ever watched it or if I caught some of it, but yes, I'm aware of Jericho. Certainly.
It was great. But it only reminded me just like right at like the beginning, just because.
Sure.
Big fan of that show, so I mean it as a compliment. Also like you tug the heartstrings quite a bit in this one.
Yeah, I actually reread it very recently because I'm doing I might as well say it, I suppose. I'm doing some movie treatments at the moment for some of my stuff, because I know. Look, there's a million miles to go. Who knows? But I've had someone express an interest, so I'm doing some treatments. And that meant I had to reread The Finite, because one of the things I was doing was kind of, and here's a weird thing, I'm budgeting the stories when I'm reading them. So I'm reading them going, okay, how many locations is this? How big would the cast have to be? What are the effect shots? All that kind of stuff, right? And kind of pricing it out as written, which is a totally different way of looking at the story. But I hate admitting this because it's really bad. I had to stop reading it. I had to put The Finite down. I was thinking I'll just plow through it and I got to them going in the garage and it started raining, and I was just like, I can't. I know what's coming and I can't do it. And I had to put it down. And then I finished reading it a couple of days ago and I actually made myself cry. I got to the end and I started crying. I thought, wow, nice one.
Yeah, it's quite the tearjerker, and I never tell people not to read certain books, but I do, and I don't want to say why because spoilers. But
sure.
there is someone in my life who I have told not to read that for a specific reason. But
it's biographical reasons, absolutely,
yeah. It's a really great story. I really loved how you brought about things in A Song for the End, because that is just such a fun idea.
You know what? I remember exactly where that idea came from as well, which is unusual. So that came from a dream I had. I was in my rock band, the Disciples of Gonzo. And I was just, we were writing songs, we had that, and I was still just about young enough to think like, well, maybe we could make a go at this, And we had a really good rehearsal night before. I'd stayed up late, I'd slept. And that thing when you're just waking up and you have dreams, and they're almost not even really dreams. They're almost just like a single scene. They're little snippets, they're little half dreams, half imaginings or daydreams. And I had, the image was me in my Disciples of Gonzo street uniform, stage uniform, which is like my flared trousers I wear at conventions, the boots of rock, the leather jacket I'm wearing, all that kind of stuff. And I'm in number 10 Downing Street, and I've got my feet up on the desk and a cigar going. And I can't remember who the Prime Minister was at the time. Might have been Gordon Brown, might have been Cameron, just standing there like almost cap in hand, being like, So what's your first, like, what are you gonna do now you're in charge of everything? I was like, whatever the fuck I want. And I remember waking up and thinking, okay, well, obviously that's really goofy, but the thing about it that stuck with me was, like, I think about, like, the bands that I really love, and especially, like, the bands that have a more kind of political message. I mean, I think Rage Against the Machine are one of the most important bands of my lifetime, and for me personally, but for music in general. I think when they came out in '91 and did what they did, they changed things forever. And I wouldn't like hip hop if it wasn't for Rage Against the Machine, because I was a metalhead, and they opened my eyes to a whole genre of music that's really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But also they did what they did better than it. But they invented new metal 10 years before anyone else and did it better than anyone else ever managed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't count Slipknot in that, because I don't consider them new metal. They're the last great thrash metal band, but that's another argument. But the point is, I thought about Rage Against the Machine, and I thought about how weird it must be to write music that good and that incendiary and put it out in the world and have it touch that many millions of people as they did, and it not make any goddamn difference to the shit show that the world ended up becoming. You know what I mean?
I remember when Killing in the Name Of was the Christmas #1, and that really felt that was like, I am so happy that I was in my 20s participating in that, for like that was so, it was so funny, but also that the reason behind this was like, yeah. And then I remember listening on the radio as they announced that was the Christmas #1, and the presenter was so annoyed. You could hear it. He was like,
yeah,
here you go.
You
this
asked
is what
for it.
you all. And I remember having the funniest conversation with my mum. My mum's a very light, cheery person, and she enjoys a lot of different things. And she doesn't watch it any. I don't even know if it's still going, but she stopped watching the X Factor years ago. But that was like a staple program in the house for a bit. And that I only remember that's the year that Joe McElderry won.
That's right.
And because I didn't even watch it anymore at that point, but I only remember it because of this funny conversation with my mum where I was like, Rage Against the Machine, Christmas #1, and she was like, oh, couldn't you all just let little Joe have his #1? And I was like, that's exactly the point of the, it was like a movement, and I was like, and that was exactly the point, is why should he get automatically? Exactly. I was like, also, he hasn't sold any less.
Right.
He has sold
probably sold more, right?
Yeah, he has sold exactly the amount he was going to sell. It's just that people that don't normally buy into this, put Rage first. But I was like, he's doing fine, Mom. He's, his first ever release, he got a #2 for Christmas. Like, it's not. But she was like, oh yeah. But yeah, that's the only reason I remember Joe McElderry, is because my mum was like, oh, he's he was so Joe, sweet and lovely, and I was like, oh, he was. I'm not saying he wasn't deserving, but it's just it was it wasn't
about him though, was it? It was Simon Cowell.
It was about the X Factor winner automatically getting the #1 and all that stuff. So I saw Rage Against the Machine at Download Festival, like the year right after that happened, and they said like, yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
This isn't really about Simon Cowell, but
yeah.
Sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was sorry, that's a bit of a tangent. I was gonna say about this is you can either read this as like a good old-fashioned horror romp about the end of the world, brought about by, and you can take it lightly. You could take this as like a fun end of world read, as end of world reads go, or if you're like me and I overthink everything. Oh, I'm glad you got that from that. Even if it was whether it's their intention or not. But I read this as sort of a comment on like the power of like subliminal messaging almost, because obviously people who hear the song, things happen. And I was just thinking about how many messages we're fed on a daily basis without knowing. Because we're conditioned to absorb certain sorts of media, and we're of an age where we saw the internet come in, and we saw the birth of social media. And it's so strange because I got relatives with children or like younger relatives that never didn't have Facebook. It was like
right. Yeah.
never didn't have a phone with the internet and access to all this stuff. And I just can't, it's so hard to try and put yourself in the mind frame of somebody who did not experience life before this. And the older I've got, the less I've put out on social media. Like I post about books and films and things I'd like to talk about with people, but I share a lot less of myself.
Sure.
Sometimes I accidentally just say things in interviews. But yeah, I'm starting to think about now, like, so 20 years from now, when there are loads of studies that have come out that have been going on currently, where I'm like, oh, how much should you say to the entire world and just hand your information over, and who's using it?
Yeah. And we all just tick that box that says accept all without reading a goddamn word of what we're accepting, right? And I mean, that's where a lot of the chat GTP like horror shows coming from, right? It's like, well, yeah, sure, because you signed away your rights to everything you published, and now it's being used to train idiot bots to appear intelligent to write stuff for us. Great, wonderful. I'm sure that's gonna go great. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think it's interesting what you were saying there about A Song for the End and about subliminal messaging. I mean, I think, funny enough, I was almost coming at it from the other end in the sense of like, I was thinking about Rage Against the Machine writing all these songs and not changing the world, and thinking like, what if you actually did, right? Like, what if you did write a song that changed the world? But then it's like, and then you think about like, okay, but I mean, in the particular case of what this song does, it's like, okay, well, there's pluses and minuses to that, it turns out, you know, to put it mildly. I think the fun thing about A Song for the End for me was how much I found myself gaining sympathy with the nominal antagonist as I wrote it. Like, he was meant to be the bad guy at the start, but by the time I got about halfway through, I was like, well, you know, I don't know. He's kind of got a point. Like, it's not good, but I don't know. Like, yeah, interesting.
there's and I think anyone who creates anything, like any kind of, like anyone who's a musician or a writer or an artist, the idea of like something that you've made and you're really proud of, and then you unleash it and you're like, oh, well, that's not where oh no.
I mean, it ties back in what we were talking about earlier as well with Rage, right? I mean, like, seriously, you know, King pulled that book because it turned up in one too many lockers and one too many school shooters, and he was just like, I don't want it to be any risk at all that something I put out in the world might inadvertently be encouraging or seen as, you know, whatever. And I don't think it is. I mean, I've read Rage. I don't think it is. I don't think it is exploitative, and I don't think it is. You know, I mean, I think the reason that, if Rage is dangerous, which I don't think it is, the reason it is because it was written by a man who has an incredible talent for empathy, who was trying as best as he could to get inside the head of someone who would do something completely horrific. And I think maybe if there's a flaw or a fault to doing that, what it does is it makes someone like that perhaps more sympathetic than they should be. I don't know. Yeah, but then what do I mean by should? What does that even mean? Because we are all human beings. So I don't know. I go back and forth on it.
I think maybe there's an element of like cognitive dissonance when you know, when you feel like very strongly, I should not have any sympathy for this person whatsoever, no matter what, because look at what they did. But then if you actually look at the human, you're like, and then you do feel something, you're like, oh, and then you feel at odds with yourself. Maybe that's where that comes from. You feel a bit like, you feel like you're on the wrong side of something.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I went through a phase as a teenager. I really wish I didn't, because now I can't unknow all of this stuff. And the older I get, the scarier it is. But I went through a serial killer obsession. When I say obsession, it was an interest. But I was watching everything I could find about like Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. And oh my God, do I wish I didn't know anything about Ted Bundy now? Because it's like, when you're 18 and you're still a bit impervious to the like the risks of the world,
right?
You think nothing will ever happen to me, and then it's I don't know if my personal sense of empathy was fully formed at that age, because I used to watch serial killer stuff, think, oh cool, and then like, oh my God, I don't know why I brought that up.
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, you should chat to George about that sometime, because I think he's had a similar kind of experience, and I know that he's got a fascination with that. I mean, where I always come down to it in terms of fiction and fictional psychopaths is, I've done this riff a couple of times, but Hannibal's the one that bothers me, because I always think like he is just, and I get it, right? Like, it is a work of fiction, and he is a kind of fictionalized kind of uber monster, kind of uber psychopath, right? And I get the idea that like it's this attempt to recreate this kind of Nietzschean beyond good and evil vibe. But my problem with it is always the thing that nags me at the back of my mind is like, whenever I see like Silence of the Lambs or any of the ones following that, I always feel like then in real life they're never that interesting, they're never that charismatic, they're never like, they're not, they're sort of facilely a bit, and they're never that bright either. Actually, they're not as bright as they think they are, that's for damn sure. And it kind of bothers me because it kind of, I do think that there's a danger of romanticizing, which sounds like a weird thing to say about Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal Lecter and Silence of the Lambs, because he's not a romantic figure per se, except he kind of becomes one a little bit by the second movie. It's like, well,
it happens in real life. Like, didn't Ted Bundy get married while he was on death row? Like, I like, so when the entire world knows what he did and he still managed to get a woman interested in him, I thought, what the like, crazy. I got into a weird we had a class dispute about this when I was in uni, because someone did a presentation about I don't know why this was their topic, I can't remember what the brief was, but they were talking about Ted Bundy and
sorry if you can hear my dog.
It's the Ted Bundy talk. He didn't like it.
Yeah, apparently Ted Bundy's outside the house right now, and Ziggy is not having it. Ziggy, shush, come here. Ziggy, come here, darling. Come here. It's okay. Aww. It's okay, kid. You got me. I'm safe. Come here, darling. Yeah, I'm here. Look, come here. There we go. It's all right. She's fine.
It's all right. I've had a low key trying to hit my door down for the entire time we're talking.
Yeah, no, she's had enough. Hey, calm down. It's okay.
They were talking about Ted Bundy and the influence. They were talking about the influence that media has on people and how it can create killers, right? And they used Ted Bundy as their example because in one of his final interviews, he blamed porn and said, "Oh well," and they were even Ted. But I was like, Ted Bundy was desperately trying to get off being death penaltied. He was like, he was very vocal that he did not want to die. He was trying to get his conviction overturned. He was trying to get the death penalty overturned right up until it happened. I was like, you don't think that he would say anything to like appeal to people to be like, oh look, this could happen to anyone. And it was like, I'm not listening to anything that guy says.
Also, though, like on a fundamental level, when you engage with that argument for more than 5 seconds, you think, well, hang on a minute. If pornography turned men into serial killers, everyone would be dead. Like, what are you talking about? Like, it just doesn't.
The same brush or anything, but I think men.
You know, like I think it's a little bit more. And again, like you and I, right? We're horror fans, so we remember like Satanic Panic. We remember Child's Play 3 after the Bolgemers. We remember all this shit. Like it goes around. Like there'll always be something in the creative field that gets blamed, like whether it's heavy metal or hip hop or horror movies or whatever, right? And it's just like, it's such obvious bollocks, you know. It's like, for those of us who are fans of the genre and stuff, it's like, nah, you know, like I read this shit all the time, and I think I'm, if anything, probably slightly better adjusted than the average person in the street as a result.
Yeah, I find horror is a great place to. It's actually a great genre for eliciting empathy and showing different viewpoints, and I think it's good. I basically only read horror and nonfiction, and I usually just come out of it thinking, oh, the real world doesn't seem quite as bad now because this isn't happening. I just read Tim Lebbon's Coldbrook, and oh my god, I love zombies, but I was like, well, you know, the worst thing that's going to happen in my day-to-day is that I have to leave the house to go and buy snacks, and that's slightly inconvenient to me, but so yeah, perspective. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It's a good place to like examine perspectives.
but I also think, for me anyway, I think horror, whether I'm writing it or reading it, horror or watching it, it's the ultimate kind of safe space to explore the unsafe, right? That's the whole point. you know, and the better the writer or the creator is at getting me right close up to the edge of the horror, right up to seeing it, feeling it, or feeling like I'm even experiencing it in the moment, the more I appreciate the work, because you know, I come through the other side, because at the end of the day, you can put the book down, you can turn the movie off, you do get to the bit that says the end, and then you go about, you're back in your world and you're going about your day. And it gives you that incredible gift of you know, a space in your life to think about the things that we aggressively don't think about most of the time. And I think, I don't know, I think it does make you more empathetic. I think it also, I was thinking about this conversation I was having with trying to remember who it was I was talking to at a convention. Was it Dave Watkins? Is that a guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking. It's a guy. I was talking to Dave Watkins. Yeah, Exeter Incident. Yeah. Fantastic book. Really loved that. Great bit. Talking of like pulp action horror. Wonderful. But anyway, I was talking with him, and he was talking about, like, it was our first post COVID convention. And he was talking about how he'd been in Italy when COVID was starting to come there. And he said, remember him saying, like, he was talking to his wife about whether or not they were going to go into quarantine, or whether or not they were going to try and get ahead of it and go home. And he said, you know, I actually said, I just don't want to be that guy in the zombie movie. You know, who just carries the infection back. Like, I'm just not going to do it. I'm not going to be that guy. And I thought, like, that is such a horror fan thing to say, but it's also like a great example of, like, it actually translating into real life. You know, like, yeah, okay, I've thought about this a little bit, I've seen this play out, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be the other guy.
That was crazy, the pandemic, for bringing out, like, you knew who the horror fans were.
Yeah.
It was really, do you mind? Thank you. Attacking my chairs. We my household, I felt like we were on red alert because I don't have a spleen, so I was high risk, and obviously we didn't know anything about it. So it was it felt like a very real like, I mean, not that it wasn't real, but you know what I mean? Like, all of a sudden I was like, I have never felt under threat from just going out and breathing air before, because that was the extent that they were saying on the news. Like, it's we're not sure how it's traveling, and if you go out and you're within a certain distance of someone who's so it was. And I remember when we were, you know, first able to go back out, I was just going for walks, and if I saw someone coming the other way with a dog, I was like, am I going to walk through the cloud of air they just breathed? Like, it was like, and to think back on it now, it's like, it's almost laughable, like how anxious I was, but not really, because it's a real virus and people died. But I just remember, like, my husband being at odds with his boss because he works in software, so he could, and he was, I don't want to be like just an apprentice, but him not being in the office would not have affected the company whatsoever. So he was like, oh, I'm going to work from home because it's software, so I work remotely anyway, even when I'm in office. And his boss was like, well, no, we need you in. And he was like, well, my partner's high risk and I don't want to risk. And he was like, well, I don't see how that affects you. And he was like, well, it's going to affect me if I get it and take it home and kill it. Like, but yeah, and he was like, well, he's like, I'm not being that guy that for a company that cares this little about me, I'm not going to go in. And like, things were never the same for him. He's works somewhere else now, but that was the beginning of the end of his whole work relationship there. And I was like, that's crazy, isn't it? Like,
so a lot of employers ended up showing their entire asses during that in a really bad way. Some didn't. There were some notable exceptions. Some people stepped up and did well, but there were a lot. I mean, don't get me started.
It was
I've got my horror writer hat on. You're going to make me put my trade union hat on, and then I'm going to kick off. Right, we'll be going for another 4 hours.
It was just that constant feeling that we didn't know if we were overreacting at all times during, like, that was like, I was like, do I stock up on stuff? Do I buy just a year's worth of cleaning products now? I don't know.
Gallons of hand sanitizer is enough. I don't know. I just don't know.
Is Amazon still delivering books?
That's when you know it's the apocalypse, right? When you can't get your state delivery from Amazon, that's when you know that's when the shit's really hit the fan.
When your book parcels stop arriving, that's when you need to really worry. When Jeff Bezos decides it's too dangerous to make money.
Exactly, can't squeeze another 10 cents out of the world, then
Right, I've kept you longer than most, so I do have one last question for you before I let you go.
No
And you
problem.
might know that this is coming, Kit.
Yeah,
This is the most important thing I'll ask you.
yeah.
Do you know what this is?
I was really tempted to cheat and take a screenshot and do a Google image search, but I was strong and I didn't, and I don't.
I'm proud of you for that. And if you hang around when we stop recording, I will let you know. I'll let
Cool.
you in. You'll be in on the know of it. As always, if this is the first interview you're watching, for anyone in the comments that does know what this is, there is a prize. It's turned into a thing now. But so far, yeah, no one has known. But I'll tell you when we start recording. Okay, so I will put links in the description for all of Kit's anywhere you can find him if you'd like to, I mean, like his public information, not his home address,
Please don't do
and
that.
links to his work. Also, I'll pop a link in for George's channel because we talked about him a lot at the beginning, and we haven't even said his surname, so people are probably like, "Who is George?" We just made him up. Yes. So once again, thank you so much for being here, Kit. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on the channel and poke your brain a little bit.
No, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the interviews you've done so far. It was a great honour to be invited. So no, thank you. It's a great pleasure.
And we'll get you back when you have a release.
I would love that.
If I can convince you to come back.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Great. Alrighty. We're going to say bye to everybody for now, and I'll see you next week. Delete.